Localizing a lesion on your neurology examination is like detective work. It can become very confusing and complicated very fast. Today we'll focus on giving you just enough information about anatomy and neurophysiology to be able to localize where a lesion is and come to a clinical diagnosis. The spinal cord receives information from the senses, namely touch, pain, temperature, vibration, and proprioception, and sends up this information to the brain through the sensory or ascending pathway. In the other direction, the brain relays motor signals down to the muscles through the spinal cord, moving the body about through the motor or descending pathway. This voluntary movement is facilitated through the pyramidal tracts, which we will focus on in this video. There's also extrapyramidal tracts involved in involuntary motor function, but we'll leave that for another video. Now let's start. We'll start with the sensory ascending pathways. The dorsal column is the first one we're going to look at. It's also called the posterior column. It transmits signals of fine touch, vibration, and proprioception from the skin all the way to the brain through the spinal cord. Signals stay on the same side until reaching the medulla, where the fibers decussate to the other side, meaning that if I touch your right arm, the signals goes up on the right side of the spinal cord in the dorsal column until it reaches the medulla, where then it crosses to the other side. This is important because if there is a lesion, for example, if you are, God forbid, in a car accident, and you cause trauma to the right side of your spinal cord, and the dorsal column is affected, then you would lose touch, vibration, and proprioception on the right side of the body in a dermatomal pattern below the site of the injury. Another major sensory pathway is the spinothalamic or the anterolateral tract. This tract transmits signals of crude touch. This is non-discriminatory touch, such as tickling or itching. Also sensations of pain, temperature, and pressure. It's got two branches, the anterior and the lateral. The fibers decussate at the level of the spinal cord and not above at the medulla. This is important because if there is a lesion on the left side of the spinal cord, then it would cause loss of pain, coarse touch, and temperature on the contralateral side. This is different to the dorsal column and to the corticospinal tract that we're going to discuss later, right? So it's important to remember the spinothalamic tract, it decussates at the level of the spine. It doesn't decussate above at the level of the medulla. Now, another sensory tract that I want to mention shortly is the spinocerebellar tract. These are involved in proprioception from the upper limb, lower limbs, and the neck. Lesions in the cerebellar tract would cause cerebellar ataxia and problem with coordination and proprioception. There are many other sensory tracts and little fibers. There's multiple sensory or ascending pathways to discuss, but these are the main ones, and these are the ones that I think is clinically relevant to us as medics. So this is it for the sensory pathways. As for the motor or the descending tract, it's made up of the corticospinal or the pyramidal tract, that has a lateral and anterior fibers, and the extrapyramidal tract. Today, as I said, we're going to focus on the pyramidal, the corticospinal tract. It's made up of the lateral tracts, which is 90% of the tract, and the lateral tracts, they decussate at the medulla, at the pyramid. These are a bundle of tracts that are visible as ridges on the medulla. The lateral corticospinal tract fully decussates, but the anterior corticospinal tract, which is this olive shape here in the front, these make up 10% of the corticospinal tract, and they don't decussate at the medulla, and only decussate when reaching the level of the spinal cord, where they will synapse onto a lower motor neuron. Now, both of these, the anterior and the lateral tracts, are responsible for movement, for fine voluntary movement. But the lateral column is involved in more distal movement, as those of the hands and feet. And these are the ones that are affected mostly in stroke patients, where you elicit weakness in the limbs, wherein the anterior columns are involved more in proximal movements, as those of the trunk. Now, if we follow how the signal is transmitted, let's follow the lateral corticospinal tract, which makes up the majority of the voluntary motor tract, as it goes down from the brain to the muscle. It all starts with initiation of a motor impulse at the prefrontal cortex in the brain. It goes down to the medulla, where it decussates at the pyramids and goes down the contralateral side of the spinal cord. So the left side of the brain controls the movements on the right side of the body. At the level of the spinal cord, the fibers synapse onto a lower motor neuron, which goes from the anterior horn of the spinal cord to the effector muscle. And this is important because any lesion above the synapse with the lower motor neuron at the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord causes an upper motor neuron lesion. And the signs are different between and differentiating between an upper motor neuron lesion and a lower motor neuron lesion is clinically very important because it helps us localize where the lesion is. So as we said, anything, any lesion, any problem. So when we say lesion, for example, any problem with blood supply, such as strokes, any tumors, any trauma, any demyelinating conditions, any inflammation affecting the brain, the cortex, the brain stem, or the spinal cord, all the way down to the synapse at the level of the where the fiber synapse onto a lower motor neuron. This classifies as an upper motor neuron lesion, and it's going to give us signs of hyperreflexia, hypertonia, clonus, upcoming plantars, and weakness. Now, why do we get increased reflexes and increased tone in upper motor neuron lesions? Understanding this, again, if you understand the simple physiology, you don't have to memorize this anymore. So basically, when you, for example, if I tap on your patella and that causes a reflex, it contracts your quadriceps and it extends your knee, right? The reason this happens is this tap on the knee creates a reflex movement that's modulated in the lower motor neuron. It's modulated in the muscle and in the spinal cord. It doesn't go up. This signal is not transmitted down from the brain and the spinal cord to the muscle. It's something generated in the muscle and the local nerves there. So if you think about it this way, if you have a stroke where the upper functioning, the higher motor functioning is not working anymore, then there's nothing to control this reflex. So the higher order functioning regulates these reflexes. So it doesn't let the reflex be too much. It regulates it and inhibits it. So you get only a bit of a contraction when you tap on the patella. But if there's a stroke and that part of the brain is not working anymore, then there is nothing to counteract that reflex, and the reflex and the tone is exaggerated. This is what gives us hyperreflexia, hypertonia, clonus, and upgoing plantars when we assess for the Babinski sign, right? And we also get weakness in upper motor neuron lesions. This is in contrast to lower motor neuron lesion, where it's the opposite. We get hyporeflexia, hypotonia, downgoing plantars, and weakness. The weakness is a bit more in lower motor neuron lesions. And we also get muscle wasting. Now, the reason for this is that the lower motor neuron actually secretes some growth factors that helps the muscle retain its bulk. So when the lower motor neuron is injured, we see a lot of muscle wasting. This is very apparent in polio patients. If you've ever seen someone who's been affected by polio as a child, you see that one of their limbs usually is very wasted. Right, so let's go through some clinical scenarios now. Let's put this together and see whether we can do some detective work. Clinical scenario 1, a 78-year-old male had a really bad fall off of a flight of stairs, and you see them in the emergency department. You examine their neurology, and on examination you find that they've lost all power in the right lower limb. So if they've lost power in the right lower limb, what tract is this? As we said, power is the corticospinal tract, voluntary power. So right lower limb means the right side of the corticospinal tract has been affected. So there's a lesion in the right corticospinal tract. Proprioception and light touch is also lost in the right lower limb. Now this tells us that there is a lesion in the dorsal column as well. Proprioception and light touch, that was dorsal column. So there is a lesion in the right dorsal column and the right corticospinal tract. Now lastly, there's lost temperature and pain sensation in the left lower limb. So this is on the other side. Now this tells us that there is a lesion in the right spinothalamic tract. I hope this is coming together now all. Remember, we said the corticospinal and the dorsal tract, they decussate in the medulla. So if there is a lesion in the spine, it's going to give you symptoms on the same side, wherein the spinothalamic, it decussates straight away in the spinal cord. So if there's a lesion on the right side, it's going to give you symptoms on the left. So this is a case of Brown-Séquard syndrome, or hemidissection of the cord, where the trauma caused injury to one side of the spinal cord. It gives ipsilateral loss of corticospinal and dorsal column functions, and contralateral spinothalamic function loss. Right? So you see how using this neuroanatomy now helps us in diagnosing syndromes, clinical scenarios. Right, clinical scenario number 2, we've got a 60-year-old male with lung cancer that develops gradual weakness in the legs bilaterally. You see them in the emergency department and you examine them, and you notice a lost power in the lower limbs bilaterally. Now, what does this tell us? It means that there's a corticospinal injury on both sides, right? Bilateral corticospinal injury. Now, the vibration and light touch sensation, you notice, is preserved. And this means that the dorsal column is intact. We don't have any problem in the dorsal column. Temperature and pain sensation is also lost bilaterally. So temperature and pain, this is spinothalamic. So spinothalamic and corticospinal tracts are affected, and dorsal column is spared. So we see this is a problem in the anterior and lateral part of the cord, but the posterior part of the cord is intact. So this gets us to the diagnosis straight away. Even if you haven't heard of this, you know that the problem is the anterior cord. So this is actually anterior cord syndrome, secondary to bony metastasis to the spinal cord, but it's not affecting the whole of the spinal cord. It's only affecting the anterior and lateral segments and sparing the dorsal column. Now, going to our last clinical scenario. This is an actual question from an actual MRCP question from MRCP Updates past papers. A 24-year-old man presents to the emergency department because he's unable to walk. He's a habitual user of nitrous oxide canisters. Lower limb examination reveals spasticity, clonus, and hyperreflexia with upgoing planters. The question is, what else are you most likely to find? So if we look at these signs here, these are signs of a corticospinal tract lesion, right? So spasticity, clonus, hyperreflexia, upgoing planters, this is corticospinal, and it is upper motor neuron lesion, right? So whatever disease process we have is affecting the corticospinal tract. Now, it's asking what other tract is going to be involved, because of these symptoms, pain, pressure, temperature, deep touch, these are all spinothalamic, if you remember. And then proprioception, that is dorsal column. So this disease, is it going to affect the dorsal column or is it going to affect the spinothalamic? So if you understand anatomy now, you can make an informed decision. Now you know what you have to answer. So looking at the offending agent here, it's nitrous oxide. And we know that nitrous oxide abuse causes B12 levels to drop. And this low B12 causes subacute combined degeneration of the cord. Now, if we look at that term in itself, subacute means that the presentation over weeks or months, and combined degeneration of the cord means that there's combined tracts, and the two tracts that are involved are the corticospinal tract, which we see in the stem itself, and the second tract that this disease process affects is the dorsal column. So the correct answer is going to be D, impaired proprioception, because nitrous oxide leads to B12 levels being low, and that causes a subacute combined degeneration of the cord, affecting the corticospinal tract and the dorsal column. All right. So that's it, folks. Thank you for watching the video. On the screen, you will see 2 other videos. One is one where I answer 5 neurology questions, 5 neurology MRCP questions, and go over my my technique in answering the questions. And the other one is how to prepare for MRCP Part 2. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.